Hello, this video is basically about how mobs spawn. So this is going to be something for people who want to step out of just building other people's farms and start designing their own for their own purposes. So if you already know how to design farms and you're already familiar with the mechanics, or you have no interest in learning them and you just want to continue to copy other people's farms, this video probably isn't for you. But if you're interested in starting to design your own things, then this video is made especially for you, and it's going to basically cover all of the main mechanics behind why mobs spawn, but not go too in depth in a way that is hard to understand. So, there are quite a few core mechanics behind the way mob spawning works, and the first one is the despawn sphere. So, the despawn sphere is essentially a gigantic invisible sphere around all players on the world that allows mobs to spawn and despawn inside of it. So the entire despawn sphere is in a radius of 128 blocks around a player. So this is a 256 by 256 spherical area, and I can show you that with a visual right now. So if we look at this area, we can see there's a gigantic red sphere around here. And this sphere, it's huge. This is the area that mobs could spawn around players. So basically, within this sphere, mobs are able to spawn, right? And they are also able to eventually randomly despawn. However, there are also two smaller spheres around the player that are also worth noting. The first one is the 24 block sphere around the player. And this sphere is an area starting at the player and going out 24 blocks in all directions from the player, which is a place where mobs are completely unable to spawn. This is so that mobs don't just literally spawn right on top of you. So the mobs can spawn in between this 24 block and the 128 block radius around the player within these two spheres. However, there's also yet another third sphere around the player, which is a 32 block radius, which basically dumbs down mobs' AIs once they're outside of this range. So basically mobs within 32 blocks of you will just randomly wander around and walk around. But a mob, 100 blocks from you, which is one you probably aren't looking at, is not going to be wandering around, and this is simply to reduce lag on the game. However, even outside of this range, mobs still interact with other mobs. They will still do things like fight each other. But basically the mobs just stop pathfinding around to random places on their own. So, now that we see the despawn sphere, and if you remember beforehand that the despawn sphere in this area basically went down to right there, and it didn't really have anything else around it. So this basically means that all of the spawning spaces are only available in my farm. Now, the spawning spaces on a mob farm basically have a few special requirements for them. Spawning spaces can be one of the most important parts of any mob farm, because obviously you need a place for the mobs to spawn on a farm, right? So this makes it one of the main limiting factors in how fast any given mob farm is. In the case of this farm, we can see that the mobs spawn on these 10 diamond shaped plates, and then we have the mob collection system which pushes them down to their death. So that kind of goes into other areas, but I just want you to know or understand that obviously they need spawning spaces, and these spawning spaces are generally made with some special thing in mind, and we can cover more details on that later. So now we're going to look at height map, and I think one of the best ways to explain height map is actually using this little setup I have here. So the way that mob spawning works in Minecraft is that there's a system that goes through, and on any X and Z coordinate, so it could be here, it could be here, but just this specific block, right, at any Y level, it will go through and it will check between the basically Y0 specifically, so the lowest block in the world, and the highest block in the world. And it will check all of these spots individually, and then it will set a chance of failure for each block here. So this basically sounds really complicated, but the simple answer is that whatever the highest block in a given XZ coordinate is will determine how fast mobs can spawn on that specific block. So a good example of this would be this block is at Y2, so there is a 50% chance that the spawn will fail here. Whereas if we made it down here on Y1, Actually, the block is at y0, but the mob spawns on y1, so there'd be a 100% chance. And I'll show basically the algorithm for that later, but for right now, I want you to basically see this visual representation I have of it. So if we look here, we have this very high block in the world, and the algorithm has to check all these spots. And you can see, if we pretend that the algorithm is this armor stand, it takes the longest amount of time to go up and back down on this system. Whereas if we lower the block a little lower, it takes much less time to come back down. And the lower we go, the better it becomes. So essentially, the way that this works actually is that there's a 1 divided by whatever the y level of the highest block on that specific area is, chance for the spawning attempt to fail on a specific block. So even if we have, this is our spawning layer, and then we go up to height limit and we place a single piece of string and then remove everything in between, this block will spawn mobs as if there is basically as if you're trying to spawn them way up at height limit. So when it comes to mob farming, it's very important to be conscious about what the highest level or the highest Y level of all your spawning spaces are. And if you're doing something under the nether roof of the nether, like a fortress farm, you should remember that the bedrock above on the nether roof will actually make the height map much higher than the actual farm. And that is why removing the bedrock above a fortress farm is such a big deal to technical servers. Now I'm going to show you something called, I want to call it mob sorting, although I don't think this is an official term. So what I mean by mob sorting is essentially making mob farms that produce specific mobs only, even though multiple different mobs could technically spawn. So the 3 main ways to separate mobs spawning are biomes, bounding boxes, lighting, and space. That was 4. Well, you get the point. So I have a small example here of basically just using biomes to separate which mobs spawn. So in the yellow, we will only have magma cubes because we're in a basalt delta biome, as you can see by the gray sky, whereas the red will only have pigs spawning because we are in the nether waste biome, as you can see by the red sky. And if we fly away and back up, we will see them spawn as I said they would. Now it's going to take a little bit longer because we are at a high Y level and I didn't make a very big platform, but you can see magma cubes in the yellow. And there we go. Wait, did I mislabel this? They spawned here. Hold on. Let's see. Oh yeah, I just mislabeled it. We can see on the F3 screen right there that the biome here is still nether waste. So yeah, they were supposed to spawn there too. My bad. Anyways, that's just one way that mobs can be sorted, but there are actually a lot of different ways for mobs to be sorted. Whether that be wither skeletons being the only mob able to spawn on wither roses, or maybe that being creepers as the only regular overworld mob that can fit underneath of a trapdoor, aside from spiders, which can also be filtered in their own way. Or even in a Soul Sand Valley, where the ghast is able to spawn in lit up blocks, but the skeleton requires darkness. So, recapping on the 4 main parts that actually make up a mob farm, we have the area where the mobs spawn, then we have the area where the mobs are collected and sent to their death. And we could see those 2 things are combined in this example because they spawn in the water, which immediately sends them to the portals, which drops them to their death. So the best mob farms generally combine multiple of these core components into one system, because the entire point of a mob farm, at least one that is trying to max out its rates, is one that kills the mobs as fast as possible and has as many spawning at a time as possible. So what this means is that the mob farm wants to have enough spawning spaces that it is able to hit mob cap, but it also wants to be killing the mobs as fast as it possibly can. That way that mob cap isn't wasted. So after your mobs have been collected and sent to their death, they need to actually have a way of killing them. Now, one of the best ways to kill mobs is by fall damage, if that's an option. And we can see here, the mobs are collected into the nether portal and sent over to the nether. where they then die to fall damage over here. Oh god, it's so loud. Now, after the mobs die though, they drop their drops on the ground obviously, so you need to collect those items. And the absolute fastest way of doing this is to use either water streams or slime ice. But basically, there are three main ways to collect items. You can use hoppers, you can use hopper minecarts, or you can use a setup that keeps the items in item form until they're ready to be stored. So, on a very slow or basic starting system, you could just have a floor of hoppers obviously, right? But when your farm becomes too fast for a single hopper's speed, you have to go even faster. So the setup that I actually use here essentially uses pistons to push all of the drops into the center, and then over this glass pane right here, or this end rod I mean, and the pistons will push all the items down onto this obsidian, which a slime block then pushes over ice back into the overworld. And this is a good idea of how a sorting system would look for a pretty fast farm. Now, if you look a little bit closely, you'll actually see that I'm not collecting all the items. Some of them are being burned, so I need to actually upgrade this system. But I did kind of throw this together when I made it. But anyways, the idea is still there, that the items are all funneled and they are moved to where they are dealt with. Whereas if you use hoppers immediately, you are left with a much slower system. However, obviously it's a lot simpler, so if that is an option, it's generally a better one. Recapping, you want to have mobs spawn, you need to collect the mobs in some way, you need to kill the mobs, and then you need to collect their drops into some sort of storage system. Like this one. And you can see we already have a few materials here. Not bad. That sums up this video, and I hope you learned something useful. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment, and if you want me to continue doing videos like this for other topics, please let me know what you'd like to see again in the comments. And this video actually took a lot of jumping around between worlds and a good bit of editing, so I'd appreciate it if you did make it all the way to the end if you were to subscribe. And thanks for watching. Goodbye.